I'm Susie Mitchell, Programme Director for Glasgow City of Science and Innovation, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our next keynote session, entitled Why the Tech Industry Needs a Moral Revolution. Welcome, Wade Davis, to the Can Do Innovation Summit.
Thank you.
It's great to have you at the summit this year. If I may, I'd like to get straight into our questions.
Okay.
Wade, you consult for professional sports leagues and the likes of Netflix, Google, and Viacom to co-create transformative solutions to build more inclusive corporate cultures. Can you tell our audience a bit about you and your career path from NFL player to feminist educator and thought leader now on gender, race, and orientation equality?
Yeah, and I'll try to be brief. So post my time at the National Football League, and during my time there, I wasn't open about my sexuality as a gay man. And during that time, whether it was in high school, whether it was in college or the pro sports leagues, one of the things that I felt was a lack of what we would call psychological safety, or a lack of the ability to tell players, coaches, friends, or what have you, that I identified as gay. And then once I retired, I moved to New York City, because that's what every self-respecting non-out person does, is you move to a city where you can live and experience the world somewhat invisibly. And when I moved to New York City, I was just, my life was just expanded so very, very rapidly, because I was exposed to so many types of new experiences. And one of those experiences, I was offered a job at an organization called the Hedrick Martin Institute. And there I was introduced to feminism, and feminism literally changed my life. And what I often tell folks is that reading feminist literature gave me the language to describe what was happening, not just to me by other people, but also what I was doing to myself. And one of the most catalytic moments was that during a really hectic moment in the workplace, I referred to one of my women colleagues as Sweetie. And she looked at me and she said, "Don't you ever call me Sweetie." And in that moment, what I did was I retreated into this space of what I call kind of good guyism. Instead of owning that I had used language that dehumanized her and minimized her, I tried to say, well, I'm a good person and you know me, and I use that language to everybody. But what was true is that I actually only used that language toward women. So I didn't use that language for everyone. And I had a supervisor at the time that, and I'll shorten this story, but asked me to read the same book 3 times, because each time she asked me to read the book, and she asked me to kind of unpack the reason I had called my colleague Sweetie. I gave her an answer that was about the other versus doing the introspective work of realizing, like, what did me using the language of Sweetie not say about her, but say about me? Mm-hmm. And that was a catalytic moment that really opened me up and really pushed me to find what my individual purpose was, which was to start to engage in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just in the sports space, but I was the NFL's first LGBT and gender inclusion consultant. And I built out trainings and programs to try to up-level the consciousness and competencies of players, coaches, and owners. And then I was fortunate enough to transition that work into the tech space.
Yeah, it's great that you've been able to use, I guess, your position and those experiences to influence and educate now. And on that point, in relation to the tech industry, so people would say, I guess, that the tech industry, in one way, is seen as one of the most progressive industries, yet in Scotland and indeed globally, I'm sure you'd agree, we're still witnessing a worrying lack of progress when it comes to the underrepresentation of certain groups in the sector, from Black people to women to disabled people to trans people. But there is, I think, recognition broadly that we're missing out on a critical talent pool, and that the sector itself is missing out on massive untapped potential. I was actually reading recently, as a report from last year, that London's all-female led businesses received less than 0.5% of the total 5.3 billion VC invested into London's tech firms in the last 4 months of 2021, and that Black minority ethnic entrepreneurs are at even greater disadvantage with 0.02% of total VC invested. That was over 10 years from 2009 to 2019 in terms of going to Black female founders. Yeah, indeed. Wow. So in your mind, Wade, how did we get to this point? And why have many often, having worked in diversity and inclusion myself, how have many often well-intentioned D&I programs in business failed to create meaningful change in business and indeed in society as a whole?
Yeah, that's a tough question, but it's also, for me, an exciting question. And what I believe that the statistics that you offered help us to, what I also believe that the tech industry needs is a truth-telling campaign, right? Not just about other people, but similar to how my boss pushed me, but truth-telling about itself, right? So what I've learned from my time in the tech industry is that the tech industry was started by small groups of people who were very, very smart, right? And very, very well-intentioned and well-meaning, but that doesn't get us to a place of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when you talk to the CEOs and professionals who started up a tech organization, what you find is that they were in a room, in a driveway, in a closet, trying to build this thing. And as they needed help to build this thing, they grabbed the people that were closest to them. And unfortunately, many of us, our social networks lack representation also, right? So as you're trying to grow very, very quickly and you grab the closest people to you, oftentimes those closest people to you look like you, come from the same backgrounds as you, have similar experiences, whether it's university, right? So as these organizations were starting to grow and to build, people were just grabbing people who were closest to them unconsciously. And those people just happen to often be white, be heterosexual, right? Come from certain classes, right? So, and then, once the business gets to 100 people, 200 people, 500 people, and people look around and they go, oh, wow, I did not realize that everybody who I brought in were very similar to me. The challenge is that now once these institutions are built, you can't just fire those individuals who are there because they are competent and capable. So the way that we have to start to change this is to have, CEOs of companies start to admit that this was their path, so that people who are coming up in the future, right, don't make the same mistakes. Because what we're just further in doing is entrenching, right, this kind of tech segregationist kind of startup mentality, right? So the more that we tell the truth about the fact that our social networks lack representation, and when you think about the idea of referrals, right? Like referrals are an amazing tool, right? But referrals can often, again, entrench certain forms of unintentional lack of representation, which breeds forms of systemic discrimination. Because if my organization is primarily of one identity and I'm trying to bring in new folks, right, I'm now trying to engage with someone who I actually don't have any comfort with. I don't really understand their lived experiences and their background. So that can build a culture that can feel hostile to the folks in the minority group. So I think if we can start with the truth telling, right, start with honest, really hard conversations about how we got here, that gives us a chance, right, to go forward. And then next, I would say that we have to, as I&D practitioners, start to embed the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion into organizational practices and processes. And I call that hiding the medicine in the candy, right? Because we have to also be honest and say, like, these tech organizations are not nonprofits, right? They're not rooted in trying to have a justice ethic, right? Or social justice ethic, right? So we have to say, okay, like, what is the purpose of this company. Like, why does this company exist? Once we can understand the why, then we can start to help folks go, if this is your why, having higher levels of representation gets you closer to your why, helps you greater achieve your why, helps to make your business much more sustainable. But if we can't connect the principles and values of diversity, equity, inclusion into the why, our work always feels like a nice to have and not a must have.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the question of leadership, if I may, I'm going to quote the late Desmond Tutu, who once said, "If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor."
Oh,
and
yeah.
a recent survey found that in the UK found that 82% of SME leaders claim diversity matters to them, but the same survey found that most formal D&I action in SMEs remains focused on individual responsibility rather than seeing D&I as a business imperative with strategic oversight and accountability at the C-suite level. In my mind, I guess these leaders have the power to challenge and to create change. So there's a couple of questions that I had for you really in relation to that. What key self-reflective questions and practical actions do these senior business leaders need to think about and to prioritize when it comes to sort of moving on from D&I window dressing, as it were, to being accountable and intentional and strategic when it comes to, as you mentioned, embedding D&I into organizational culture? And then just a little bit at the end, can you give examples of maybe a couple of companies that you feel are beginning to really demonstrate progressive, impactful, and kind of measurable leadership and D&I practices?
Yeah, one of the things that I think about for any leader, right? If you ask any CEO to tell the origin story of their organization, this leader is going to have just a great amount of passion for their why. Like, they're going to tell you how this struggle happened to them, and because they were struggling with X, that was fuel, right, for them to go out and build this wonderful organization, right? And that story and that passion is what they need to have, the exact same, story and passion for why diversity, equity, inclusion matters to them personally. But they can't give the stereotypical talking points, right, about the business case, right? Because they would never tell you the business case for their why of what causes them to build this organization. They'll talk about a catalytic moment, either through struggle, right? So leaders have to be able to articulate how can they connect their pain and their struggle to the pain and struggle of underrepresented folks to get inside of institutions, right? Because through our struggle, through our pain is how we actually make a connection, right? And leaders, when they're trying to build an organization, they tell their origin story over and over and over again to inspire not just their partners, but their employees or what have you. Leaders have to also have the same origin story about what was the catalytic moment that caused them to deeply care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, it can't be statistics, it can't be a business story. It needs to be something deeply, deeply personal. If leaders don't have something deeply, deeply personal that connects them to diversity, equity, and inclusion, the same thing that they do to their own business origin story, then you will always have a gap. Then diversity, equity, and inclusion will always be a nice to have, because they don't have an entry point to it the same way that someone who looks like me have, right? If you ask me why I care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, as you did during your first question, I told you about pain and struggle and feeling marginalized and or less than. The same thing has to happen to that leader. And one of the people who I think has done this really, really well, and he's no longer the leader, but there was this leader, his name was Randall Stevenson. He was the CEO at the time of AT&T. And he was speaking at a Black employee resource group meeting. And this was at the height of the George Floyd murder. And he talked about how his neighbor, who is a Black man, he never really knew him, and he never really understood what it might mean to be a Black man in America. And his neighbor was another perceived very successful and wealthy person. So in his mind, he was removed from the day-to-day experiences of, let's say, your less well-off person of color, right? But when he heard one of his closest friends, I actually think he said that this is his best friend, be able to articulate it, it changed him, right? So now he's got an origin story that connects him to this actual work. So the more that we can have leaders not talk about external factors for why this matters, but it's got to be an internal job. If it's an external job, you will always find a reason that something else becomes equally important or even more important. But when it's core to who you are as an individual, you don't stop until you see substantive change.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting what you were saying there about the business case. We often hear that, don't we? We often hear business leaders who ask for the business case for diversity, inclusion in business.
I'm not a fan of asking for the business case,
no,
just
me
to be honest with you. Like, I think it's a tool, but it cannot be the root, right? Because if you think about what the business case is really asking, the business case is saying, prove to me, find me data, find me information that tells me that these people, women, folks of color, folks who are disabled, that they have value. Prove to me that they have value. And how is it possible that we're asking people to prove that they have value in an industry that they actually are not in? Like you actually have to be in the industry to actually show, right, that you're able to do X, Y, and Z. But here's the secret to why the business case is fraught, right? Is that there's no business case for heterosexual, able-bodied white men, right? Like no one's asking for the data on that. Like in the origin story of white men working in business, there wasn't no business case. It was axiomatic. It was thought of as self-evident that white men are capable and competent to build and to lead businesses. The same belief has to exist about everyone else. So when you ask for the business case, what you're really asking me is to prove you have value. And that is not okay. That's actually how we stay stuck where we are. The assumption must always be that every human being can bring and add value. Sorry for interrupting.
No, absolutely. I concur completely. Would you agree that we can all improve in terms of challenging our own biases, whether they're conscious or, let's face it, sometimes conscious, you know, not just unconscious, but conscious? And what steps could our attendees take to better, you said the phrase earlier, to better own and overcome our often deeply ingrained biases?
Yeah, I think the first step is the ownership of the fact that we are all going to step in and we're all going to make mistakes, that we all have been impacted by isms, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, all of these isms. If you actually don't have those experiences, and sometimes even if you do have that identity, right, you will be impacted by it, right? So I can admit that as someone who does not have a physical disability, right, that I have lived in a world where I have not had to prioritize what it might mean to walk up steps, right? Because it is something that I do unconsciously, that I don't worry about that, right? So I don't actively, when I move about the world, think about how, oh, going into this building may not be something that everybody can do, right? That there has not been an investment, and I use the word investment and not the language of an accommodation, right? Because like if our language doesn't match the idea that everyone has value, then our behaviors don't match those also. So the first step for all of the attendees are to just say, hey, like, I I am also impacted by how we're socialized, by the symbols, by the stories that we read, to think that some people have greater value than others. If I can admit that, right, that's the first step to increasing my consciousness, right? Because when I admit it, and then I need to tell other people about it, right? I need to have the courage to say, hey, Susie, I am ableist. I am ableist, right? And then once I can own that, hopefully that me owning it out loud puts me in a position where I actually want to do something about it. And that doing something about it means that I'm going to increase my competence in knowing, like, here are individual action steps that I can take to lessen the likelihood that I'm sexist, that I'm racist, that I'm homophobic, that I'm all of those things, right? So if I increase my consciousness, if I increase my competence, right, and have the courage to share openly, right? If you think about how we started this conversation, the first thing that I owned as a D&I practitioner was that I did something deeply sexist early on in my career, right? So all of us also have to model, right, that the ownership of it is the way out, right? By owning it, I create a form of accountability, not just for others to hold me accountable, but for me to hold myself accountable, because the last thing that I want to do as a human being who's a social animal is to continually perpetuate harm towards others, right? So once I own it, I name it, I hopefully starts to create forms of accountability. Then I trust that I'm capable to start to integrate those actual learnings, right? So if I've owned it, I can integrate it, and then I can also potentially start to help to model that journey for other people. But as long as we rest in this deep desire to be seen as good people, right? And I don't mean that we are all monsters, but all of us are going to step in, and all of us are going to make mistakes. So we need to get comfortable with that being true, and then we can get comfortable with doing the work to lessen the likelihood that we continue to perpetuate harm.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that the critical role, I suppose, that human stories have in, I guess, lifting the voices of the underrepresented. And I suppose in my experience of sort of diversity and inclusion sort of training and sort of connecting to staff about the issues, I suppose, for us anyway, and my previous role, stories just are so important in storytelling in terms of the power to move us and engage and to change us.
Oh my goodness, yes.
What would you say to, and I'm sure you've heard this multiple times, what would you say to a business leader that would say to you, oh, Wade, I just hire the best person for the job?
I would ask that leader to define, right, how they define best, right? And as they go through, like, how they define best, I would ask them, and this is what I do when I'm coaching leaders, is I say, close your eyes and describe the identity characteristics of the person who you imagine having all of those best qualities, right? And then say, how do you think it happens that the person who you're thinking of primarily sits in certain identity groups, right? But the first thing that I try to do when I'm also pushing a leader to have that level of honesty and vulnerability is I own it in myself, because no one wants to engage in this storytelling journey alone, right? So to ask someone to engage in a high level of truth telling, they've got to trust that they're not going to tell their truth and you sit back and stand in judgment of their truth, right? So when we're engaging in this work, we have to have a deep sense of curiosity about the other person and work as hard as we can to suspend our judgment, because none of us have the right to stand in moral judgment of someone else, because none of us know what we would do if we're put in that same type of situation. But what we can do, to your point, is share the stories, right? Share our experiences, because even if you were to ask me, Wade, like close your eyes and imagine a really terrible driver, right? And because I have been seduced by sexism, I always imagine a woman. always like that is my truth. Or I imagine someone of a certain age, right, which speaks to my sexism and my ageism, right? Now, the truth is, how did I get to that point? And if I can describe, right, what I believe are the characteristics of a good driver, right, I'm going to describe characteristics that have historically been associated with folks who I deem younger and folks who I deem more male, right? So if you can get people, right, when they say things like, I only want to hire the best, to say, walk me through what are the characteristics of the best, right? And then say, close your eyes and who do you imagine as the best, right? And that is a window into how we've been socialized to believe certain things about certain groups of people and other things about other groups of people. And we see that not just in the business place, but in the education space, right? All around us.
We do. We certainly see it in science, you know, when we ask kids what a scientist looks like.
Right. Yeah.
You know?
And the great thing about kids, right, is that kids can model for us a level of honesty that, as I said earlier, that it's going to take to overcome X, Y, and Z. So if you ask a kid, just describe who you think the best chefs in the world are, right? They're going to talk about a man, because on television, often than time, we see the greatest chefs that are men. But we also know that kids grow up oftentimes if they grow up in a heterosexual household, right, that is somewhat standardized. The woman is doing the primary level of cooking. So how can we get to a place where we grow up seeing women as the primary homemaker and food maker, but yet we imagine the greatest chefs as being men? But the questions and the honesty, right, get us to a point where we can move past it.
Absolutely, absolutely. On to my next question. Do you think, do you believe that social movements such as Black Lives Matter, trans rights, Me Too, can provide additional leverage to support, I guess, the much required moral revolution that reimagines and reforms tech-based industries?
I believe that that social movements, right, help to provide a mirror into ourselves, right? I try to be really honest and say that the tech industry is not a social justice organization. So some of the principles, right, that might exist in a social justice organization or a social movement, right, may not be perfectly applicable, right? But the people who are within those movements and their experiences sometimes can mirror the experiences inside of a corporate tech setting, right? So I think that we can learn, right, like how might the experiences, how might the stories that these folks are sharing within inside of the social justice movement be applicable for us to have a deeper understanding of how those experiences might be showing up inside of our organization. And then we can start to figure out, like, what can we now do about it, right? But I think the first piece is for us not to want a tech capitalistic organization to abide by the same principles. Like, we have to be really honest that the goals of both of those movements are very, very different, but the values that undergird it don't have to be, right? And if we can learn, like, how are these organizations asking us to better live out those values, right? That's where I think that we can start to make the connection and really start to leverage the learnings from these organizations.
Absolutely. One final quick question. We don't have much time left, but I know you're an avid reader, and I just wanted to ask you any sort of top tips in terms of books or resources that you might recommend to our delegates to upskill themselves on this really important topic.
Yeah, so what I try to do is read books that have experiences that are foreign from my day-to-day, right? So there's an amazing book by the actress and director Janet Mock, and the book is called Redefining Realness, right? So if you are not someone who is of transgender experience, this is a great book to not only learn about the lived experiences of folks with trans experience, but to see yourself within that experience. So my ask of you as a reader is that whenever you read a book about someone whose experiences, who you perceive that are different from yours, find yourself in their story. That's how we make a connection, right? There's another amazing book by Roxane Gay called Hunger, right? And reading that book helped me understand how much of the stereotypes and phobias that I have about people who have certain types of bodies, right? So those are, I think, two amazing books for us to read and go, huh, how do I see myself in this story? The last thing that I'll add, because I know we're short on time, is that we have to move away from asking folks in underrepresented groups to share their story or to share, like, what does it feel like to be a woman in this organization, right? You have to ask yourself, what does it feel like to be a man working inside of this organization that's overrepresented by male identified people? If you can share what that means, you automatically know what it means to be a woman, because you can almost damn near bet that her experience is not that experience, right? So we have to move away from asking people to do the labor to educate those of us in the overrepresented group. I mean, like, we have to stop asking folks who are in the marginalized group to do all of the actual labor to share all of their stories. But we need to do more asking of folks in the overrepresented group to say, share your story about what it means. Like, what does it feel like to be you? And then go, now you automatically know what it feels like to not be you.
Brilliant. That is brilliant. Wade Davis, thank you so much for your amazing, thought-provoking insight as ever, and for taking the time to be with us at Can Do Innovation Summit. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Everyone who's listening, please enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks very much.